I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. There's a portion of our baptismal covenant where we're asked, will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? And we answer, I will with God's help. I will with God's help. Because what we do for the poorest and the most vulnerable, we do for Christ himself. And this comes right out of today's gospel. It may surprise you to know that not all Christians agree about who the least of these members of my family, or the least of my brethren, as the King James Version phrases it, are. In the church I belonged to as a teenager, there was a much narrower understanding of who the least of these my brethren are, and that is the needy within the church. There was a lot of emphasis on loving one another within the body of Christ, but not much stress on feeding or clothing or caring for our neighbors, and no talk of what we might call social justice. And then there's a subset of end-time believers who hold that this scene depicts a judgment only of those left on earth after the rapture. And so it doesn't apply to you and me here and now. Another excuse for not applying this to our own lives is based on personal responsibility. Those who are poor, hungry, sick, or are somehow at fault. They didn't work hard enough or don't have enough faith. And as for those in prison, well, they were convicted in a court of law. Do the crime, do the time. I'm sure you've all heard that. Do the crime, do the time. We're very good at making these types of excuses to get out of the more inconvenient aspects of Jesus' teaching. The plainest way to read the text, and I think you would probably agree with this, is that the least of these are anyone who is in need. Anyone who is hungry or a stranger in need of shelter, or the sick, or those in prison. Today I'd like to focus on the last group of people that Jesus talks about, the prisoners. I was in prison and you visited me. What does it mean to visit those in prison in 21st century America? Like I'm sure many of you, I have been increasingly troubled in the last few months by the inequities and injustices of our legal system, especially in my case since I work in a local law enforcement agency where I do fingerprint identification work. And I certainly do my job with integrity, but I look and see a system that punishes the poor and people of color more harshly and in greater numbers than the rest of us. Now, when you think of visiting the prisoner, you might well think of prison ministry, which is certainly a great thing. And there are lots of organizations that do that visit people in jails and prisons and minister to them. And that's wonderful. But I'd like to expand our understanding of who those in prison are. Millions of people in our country are trapped, or imprisoned, you might say, in our legal system. How do we care for them? Do we dismiss the whole issue? Do the crime, do the time? Lock them up and throw away the key? Or do we exercise the compassion that Jesus commands? Because what we do to them, we do to him. The United States is the most incarcerated society in the world. According to Cairo's prison ministry in 2014, and I don't think the numbers have changed much in the last few years, our country housed 25% of the world's imprisoned people, about 2 million altogether. Millions more, though they're out of prison, are under the control of the legal system through parole and probation, or still paying fines and court fees. And if they're convicted felons, they usually lose the right to vote, in many cases permanently. I'm sure you remember the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis this past May. Officers were called to a convenience store where Floyd was suspected of passing a counterfeit $20 bill. $20. He ended up face down on the ground with a senior officer kneeling on his neck for some 8 minutes. "I can't breathe," he repeated. "I can't breathe." And finally, he was dead. $20. And the nation erupted in protests. Then there was John T. Williams, a Native American woodcarver, nearly deaf, shot to death on the streets of Seattle several years ago by a police officer because he couldn't hear the commands to put down his knife. Eric Garner, detained by police in New York City for selling loose cigarettes, who had a chokehold applied to him until he too couldn't breathe and his life was gone. Breonna Taylor, killed in her bed by Louisville police executing a no-knock warrant. I could go on and on and on. Killings by police in this country are way out of proportion to those in other advanced countries, and black and brown people are far more likely than white people to be on the receiving end. Visiting those in prison might mean advocating for changes in policing. It might mean voting for more civilian oversight over police, especially in the use of force. It might mean protesting in the streets to end police brutality. Khalif Browder was a 16-year-old in the Bronx, arrested for stealing a backpack. He was jailed at Rikers Island, the big jail in New York City, because his family couldn't afford bail. Prosecutors kept delaying the case. He was abused by corrections officers and locked up in solitary confinement for long periods of time. Khalif Browder spent a total of 3 years in jail and never had a trial. Finally, the charges were dismissed. 2 years after that, still suffering the effects of his confinement, he hanged himself. His mother became an advocate for ending cash bail until she died only a year later. Perhaps they were both casualties of this experience. Khalif's brother, Dion Browder, writes in an article in USA Today that the cash bail system disproportionately exploits low-income communities and people of color across the nation. More than 400,000 unconvicted people, he continues, are held in jails in the United States, much of the time because they can't afford bail. Visiting those in prison might mean working to end practices like cash bail that often simply punish people for being poor. Those convicted of felonies, including simple possession of most illegal drugs, face numerous hurdles to living a normal life after prison. In many cases, they're on probation or parole, liable to be sent back to prison, sometimes for fairly trivial offenses. They can be burdened with restitution and court fees, yet unable to get decent jobs because employers won't hire them because of their record. And in most states, they lose the right to vote, which is largely a relic of the Jim Crow era. Visiting those in prison might mean working for sentencing reform. It might mean amnesty for nonviolent drug offenses, for treating drug addiction as a medical problem instead of a crime. It might mean giving a voice in our politics back to those who have been disenfranchised. These are all big issues, and solving them is not a simple matter. They may seem overwhelming. We may feel powerless. However, as the recent election reminds us, we still live in a democracy. You and I have not only a personal responsibility to care for the poor and the oppressed, we have a voice in how the state administers justice. Collectively, with our fellow citizens, we own the police departments and the courts and the prisons. What our government does to help or to oppress those in need, it does in our name. Unlike first century Christians, we don't simply live under the thumb of Caesar, we also are Caesar. Visiting those in prison might mean reflecting on our legal system and what we, with our fellow citizens, can do to change that system. Visiting those in prison might mean reimagining how we keep our communities safe. It might mean listening to those who advocate for defunding or abolishing police or prisons, no matter how much we might not agree with them. It definitely means listening to the stories of those brutalized by the system, those who see police and courts and prisons as a tool of oppression. I was in prison and you visited me. What we do to those caught up in our legal system, we do to Christ the King. If we seek him in the prisoner, I believe we will find him there. This is difficult work, but we can do this with God's help.